Seeing and hearing, are the twin elixirs. Seeing and hearing are the twin elixirs of belief and disbelief. But that is best, that is a formula, if really indeed a formula, best combined with other formulas to express our thought as we ask ourselves a question. As we ask ourselves a question, the anguish of not having asked the question at the time when the question was supposed to be asked. We start off with a kind of an anguish like that, which is accessible to everyone in some sense. Well, start off with something like that, and then think about something in time that's vaster still, that goes back farther in time than one's own moral anguish, which one experiences in one's own way. But try to imagine a time going back even farther, into the times when, as I've already established it, that when we realize that the ancient primordial peoples living in the caves and dressed in animal skins knew every emotion that we know now, not only because we are the same species, but because we are of the same spirit, the same human spirit, you see. And with that as a lens to look through, you can actually begin to see how, from the very first moment that human expression came to be in, if only the medium of simple language, but also in the awareness of all the rhythms of life and the seasons and the heartbeat and the other forms of life all around one, and the fire and the rain and the earth and the sky, and of course the heavens and everything that meant. Because looking up at the stars and seeing the way that they moved gave the eyes of their mind a whole new canvas to formulate a rich view of the world. And so even then, of course, it's hardly different than now. But imagine the ways where that kind of awareness travels. It travels in the forms of the arts. It travels in the forms of music. It travels in the forms of religion and mythology. It travels in the forms of handicraft. It travels in all the common rhythms that occupy the human spirit. And so it travels then all the way in the same places, on the same ground, by the time I'm talking now about the medieval days and the 12th century. They're on the same land, they're occupying the same places. Their forms of government and social courtesy and social relationship are in a straight line built up from the Stone Age times. You could see that in so many ways. Even as these sophisticated elements are added on, aristocracy and royalty and hegemony and prerogative and all of these things, which are just as basic now as they were then. Well, anyway, so in medieval times, they're not that far removed from the dawning of human consciousness. And the forms of music, for example, and the forms of literature, of oral literature, are still operative in the same way they were in the Stone Age. And so that is their access to this aspect of the universal soul that I'm talking about. And this is why I go to this time now, the 12th century, and I try to see, to give you a glimpse through the eyes of a knight and a troubadour named Wolfram von Eschenbach, who has much to say. He says, this isn't a story that I made up myself. This is a story that I have heard from various mysterious sources. I can only tell you what I know of the way I've come to learn this story by telling you that part of the story that has become clear to me now. He would say things like this, and he would have metaphors like, whoever is able to snatch away the hair that grows from my palm can snatch. Close indeed, because there are no hairs on my palm. I'm telling the story of a knight of mixed plumage, of a magpie, of a human soul, who starts off with certain ideas, and then these ideas bring him more progressively into a more intimate relationship with life. And in this intimate relationship with life, which is expressed as a story, as a sequence of events and adventures and dramas and trials and inklings and mysteries and insights, in the course of this, a truth can be seen which is common to all of the ages, or so it would seem. This individual, his tale we tell. This is also the source of the original Bildungsroman. We can speak of heroic epic and everything, and this is that. But something also is to be drawn from this story anew each time we understand it in this way, and that is that it is a tale of character formation. So intimately connected with this central mystery of life, that it becomes a timeless kind of book which seems to speak in the universal language of the soul, which is simply the language of suffering and succor and pain and mystery and insight. It's the basic kind of stuff. Anyway, but this individual, the subject of this Bildungsroman, was raised at first in a forest. His eyes first saw the light of day in an almost solitary forest, which was actually also, by the way, it was the domain of his mother, who was a queen. But because of the vicissitudes of love and warfare and the night's necessity, she lost her husband on foreign soil, serving a distant potentate, and it grieved her so that when she gave birth to her child, she was fully convinced that the only way that he could escape the pain of love and living was to live apart, totally apart from everything else in the world. And so her domain that she ruled included this forest, the forest of Soltane, and there she raised her child. His eyes first saw the light of day. He stepped out into this forest, and it was the natural and the wild things that taught him. He had no fear of heaven and hell, for he had never learned of God, up to a certain point, of course. He had no idea that there was anyone else in the world other than the servants in his home and his mother. The truth is, he didn't even know his own name. His mother called him young master or dear boy, and that was how he knew himself. But there were, hunters, and they brought home the venison and the wild boar's meat and the wild pheasant, and he began to learn of their ways. And he seemed very, very skilled at these kind of natural ways. He built himself, designed himself from watching the hunters, his own bow and arrow. He fished with fibers of plants and bent thorns and with his hands, of course. And he was skilled in this way in the natural world. But he built himself a bow and arrow. He designed a bow and arrow. He drew back the string. He heard something in the trees. Well, it was a bird, of course, a moving thing, elusive, hard to grasp, but he'd seen the hunters do this, and so with his own bow and arrow, he shot a lark, and the arrow transfixed its heart, and it fell to the ground. And having done so, he felt terrible that he had brought pain to another life. Before this, he had no idea. He only knew the excitement of the hunt and the skill of building the things that made you more adept at this. But now something else entered his heart which was so utterly foreign. It was remorse. After that, when he was in the woods and even when he was at home listening to the sounds outside the window, whenever he heard the song of the lark, he would burst into tears because it reminded him of that time when he did that thing, that he regretted so much. And his mother, she heard him crying, and she asked him why, and all he could say was, it's the larks, it's the larks. And so his mother took this ball and ran with it. She had her gameskeepers and her field workers. She had them snare and trap and harm and destroy the larks, because she thought that it was the larks who were grieving the mind of her child. And when the boy found that out, he must have seen it, or maybe word of it came, or maybe he didn't hear the song of the lark so much, and he might have asked himself, why are my tears dry these days? Oh, I haven't heard the song of the lark these days. Where are the larks? What's happening to the larks? And so he found out what was happening to the larks was that they were being trapped on the orders of his mother. And he went to his mother and he said, I want them to live like they want to live. And his mother said to him, oh, my child, you are right, dear boy. You are right, young master. Who has the right to go against God's law that the birds should not sing? It was then, hearing his mother's voice say the word God, that he was moved to ask, who is God, Mother? And she'd never spoken to him about that before, actually. And suddenly she realized, oh, this is something I should have been doing. Well, she said, oh, God is the one who fashioned and saved the universe and took human form to do so. This was the first time the boy had ever heard language like this. But then she wanted to follow it up. She thought that she should do that. She said, oh, and then there's the devil. And the devil is the one who leads our hearts astray. And the devil is the Lord of wickedness and is to be defeated. And he heard that and he thought, So he took the ball and ran with it, you might say. These people are hearing things and hearing them from the depths of their being. And yet they are characters in formation, so they take it a certain way. And this gives us the drama of the story. They're doing now all these different things. What does the boy do? He puts away his bow and arrow. He hasn't touched his bow and arrow since he killed that lark. But he fashioned himself a javelin, like a spear that you can pierce and throw. And he fashioned himself a javelin when it was sharp and sturdy to do battle against the devil. Having heard about the devil, he made himself a weapon against the devil. And so one day he was out. He was near a trail, actually, and he heard it was a clear day. There was not a cloud in the sky. And he heard thunder. And he thought, that cannot be. No tempest approaches. And yet the thunder was coming not from the sky, but coming up from the ground, rhythmically. He looked up, of course, and he saw 3 mighty, huge horses. And riding upon them were gleaming beings with the sun reflecting off of their surfaces. It was more than he'd seen. It blew him away. He kneeled down before them, or perhaps he lay prone. And they were 3 knights, of course, dressed in armor, riding to gallop down the road on their heavy horses. And seeing some kind of lad, a peasant, fall down on the road in front of them, they being noble enough not to run him down, which not all are like that in these times. But they stopped. But they shouted down harshly, "Fool, what are you doing there? Do you want to be run over by us?" And the boy looks up and he says, "Are you God?" And they said, "We are neither God nor gods." "Who are you?" "We are knights. We ride forth on quests. We help people. We defeat evil. We have fellowship with King Arthur in Camelot." They began to tell him all these things. This was the first time he'd heard about that. And let me remind you, his father was a knight, actually, but his mother wanted him to know nothing about that. So now, for the first time, he was hearing about it from these mighty beings in armor. And he was enthralled, of course. And something called to him. If only he'd had the years to be able to abide with these strange meanings, it would have been very different. But as it was, he was on fire. He went home. Mother, I want to be a knight. And she was aghast. A knight? Who has told you about knights? And she stormed out of the room. She went to all of the house servants and all of the groundsmen. She assembled them all, and she scolded them most severely for having told her son anything about knights, because this is precisely what she wanted to protect him from. And to a man, to a woman, they told her, we've said nothing about this. This is not his way with us. He is with us. He abides with us. He watches us. He learns from us. But we don't ask or tell anything with him hardly, except if he wants food, we give it to him, or, he's the young master after all. He is my dear boy, and somebody has told him about knights, because now he knows, and he wants to be that. He's going to leave because of this. And they couldn't bring her satisfaction about how she found out, or how they could not bring her any clear picture of how it had happened literally, that he knew about knights. But yeah, he wanted to leave home and go to King Arthur's court and become a knight. And when she saw that he was bound and determined to do this, and when she realized he was of the age where this was inevitable, she knew she could not stop him. Perhaps she thought, the story tells us of the thought of the characters, what it needs to, and nothing more. So everything that I might say is speculation. Perhaps she thought of all the things that she could have told him and did not about the way upon which he was now to embark. But she did manage to say a few things to him. She said, well, here's your horse. Here are your clothes. Wear these. Always remember, when you come to a river, you cross it at the shallowest place. And seek advice from the gray-haired old. And if a woman is drawn to you in such a way as she gives you a brooch or a ring, or even a kiss, you may take it. And she said to him, and always remember your mother. And when you greet people, tell them you are greeting them on my behalf. And so he took all this to heart, Well, she gave him a horse to ride. She went to the barn and she took out the oldest, most sway-back, most malnourished, most ill-healthed horse that they have, a horse that could barely walk by itself. And she was in doubt, perhaps, that the young master would be able to ride the horse. But yeah, he was able to climb on the horse and be on the horse's back. Oh, but she dressed him in ridiculous clothing, actually. She had her reasons for doing that. She dressed him in sackcloth, all the way down to the knees, like burlap, and, a rope around the waist for a belt, in the garb of the village fool, especially when she gave him these weird galoshes, buskins, made out of barely cured leather, so that, the hide was still on, and it had a certain kind of look to it, and smell even, and it looked just like someone who would invite scorn and laughter, because she really held the hope that he would go to Camelot and be laughed into humiliation and then come back because of that. So this is how she dressed him. And then she saw him off. He took his javelin with him, perhaps in case he met the devil, But now he wanted to be a knight, and he knew that that was where his destiny lay. So he found his way to Camelot, dressed in this way. People would see him, he would call out to them on the road, "Greetings to thee, greetings, my mother told me to say that, greetings to you all." And people looked at him on his way back to horse with his odd garb, and they let him pass by, and sometimes they would smile to themselves because it was obviously some bumpkin, some fool who was walking along. And eventually, though, he came within the proximity of Camelot, and it was midday, and he came to a river, and he guided his horse along the shallowest part of the river. He crossed the river easily, and on the other side there was a tented pavilion, you might say. It was the outpost of a nobleman, a knight, without doubt, because of the way the flags were and the coats of arms on the outside and the designs of it. And he came right up to this tent. It did have a door. He knocked on the door, and then he just opened the door. And there was a woman asleep in a bed all by herself. And overhanging from the wall was a brooch, some kind of pin or necklace or locket, a brooch, and a ring. Was it a ring? I believe it was. And he took those things. He just took them off the wall. And she woke up. And at first she was frightened. She thought it was, an intruder who could be very harmful. But when she saw him guilelessly picking up her things, and then he looked at her and asked, "Do you have anything to eat?" And she realized, oh, he's simple, I suppose. Yes, I have something for you to eat. Could you please put down my brooch and my ring there? And he looks at her, he says, "Well, what? Why put them down? My mother told me to take them. So that's what I'm doing." And she was so surprised and everything. But then she, as a guest, she thought, "I will feed this simple one. He's asked me for food and I can satisfy him there." And she began to make him food. But just then, her husband, the knight, came home to the tent, and he suspected the worst, and he flew into a fit. And by then Parsifal was on his way, because he was intent on going to Camelot. Once he did these things, he might have had a bite of food. He had the ring, he had the brooch, and he was on his way to Camelot. So I think he had little understanding of what went on after he left. He was that innocent, you see. And he went on from there, and there was another river. He found the shallow place where it could be crossed rather easily, and he was soon on the other side. And then, not far from the riverbank, he heard the sound of weeping, and he knew what that was because he had wept himself. And he decided to follow that sound to see if he could help, because he'd heard the knights talking about helping people is what knights do, and he wanted to help. And so he rode his nag in that direction, and he came to a woman who was kneeling on the ground, and at her knee was a dead knight, and it was plain that he was dead. And the lad rode up to her, and he asked, "Can I help?" And she said, "There's nothing that can be done. My husband, whom I loved more than anything in the world, lies here slain." And then he asks the boy, "Was it by javelin?" And she looked up at him, at first kind of sharply, but then she saw something about him, and she just said, "No, it was not. A javelin would not be a weapon worthy of a knight to use or be slain by. It was jousting. It was a spear. It was a sword. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was all of that. It was a tournament. It was a lance. It was a fall. And now this is how it is. He's a knight, and he has died, and I grieve." And he may have asked, "Do you want me to help you bury him?" And she said something to the effect of, "No, now is not the time." And then she looked at him, And she really recognized him. I know that you, she said to him, I know that you are Parsival. Because that was his name. That was the first time that he'd heard his name spoken to him by this grieving woman. I know that you are Parsival. My mother and your mother were sisters. You are my cousin. What are you doing here? And he says, I'm off to Camelot. And she said, your father was a knight. He was slain by the actions of some unjust knights. They are your enemies. Watch out for them, she said. He said, defend the vulnerable. And this gave Parsifal an idea. Oh, the woman whose ring and brooch I took because my mother told me when I left I heard yelling. Maybe I should go back there and fight them. Maybe they are my enemies. You said I had them. Let me go after them now. And he grasped his javelin. And of course, she, in her wisdom, saw him about to go in a certain direction where they were. And she said, oh, no, they went that way. And she pointed him back on the way to Camelot. And he forgot all about what she said, perhaps, or he was so intent on Camelot, or maybe he believed her and thought he was going to meet both his enemy and Camelot. I don't know. But he came to Camelot. He saw the city in the distance. He spent the night at the hut of a greedy peasant. He knocked on the door of the hut to ask for shelter and food. The door opened up. He put his javelin in between the door jamb, or the door frame and the door. So so you see, from the beginning, you see the innocence, but you also see the instinctual, survival skills, so that the peasant could not close the door. And the peasant said, I have nothing for you if you have no gold. And he said, oh, will this do? And he offered the brooch. And the greedy one said, oh, yeah, that will do very fine. Come on in. And he was very polite to him, and they fed him. And Parsifal said, will you guide me to Camelot tomorrow? Oh, yes, I will guide you to Camelot tomorrow for a brooch like that. Let me have it now. But Parsifal said, no, I will give it to you when I am upon Camelot. So Parsifal did not give it to him till the next day. And so a little bit shrewdness there, but where does it come from? We don't know, do we? I don't know to this day. But there they were the next day at the gates of Camelot. Can you guide me into Camelot, perhaps, and introduce me? He said in his innocence. But the peasant said, no, I go no farther than these. Those people are too fine for me. I'm going back now. Give me my brooch. So he gave him the brooch, and Parsifal on his swayback nag and his weird galoshes that smelled bad and his suit of sackcloth and his javelin came riding up to the outskirts, and people were looking at him and beginning to jeer. But he paid them no mind as he issued one and all friendly greetings. On behalf of my mother, I send you these greetings. All the way to the city gates. And I think it was a page, actually, of King Arthur's court who noticed him and noticed there was something special about him. Not only was he totally ridiculous looking, but there was something in his manner that showed, an unpolished kind of bearing that the page could recognize. I suppose, having been around aristocrats and knights and being one himself, there's a certain kind of way they have of seeing through a permeating system of courtesy and decorum that gives them a platform to observe human nature and the various ways it can be expressed. He could see that by the way that this weirdo was riding this sway-backed horse. And so he went over to him and stopped him and said, so you want to go to Camelot? Well, here, come into Camelot, but let me take your horse and climb down from your horse. And when you go in, be courteous and try not to talk too much and all this. And he meant well. And so he was led right to the gates of the castle, and he stepped off of his horse, and the page took his horse, and he stepped into Camelot. He stepped in and to that place, and there was King Arthur, and there was Guinevere, and there was an unscrupulous courtier by the name of Sir Kay, and there were some other members of the court, and there were a few knights. And they looked at him and they began to laugh. But Arthur was more understanding, and he would, first of all, he would not have laughter like that in his court of this kind of derisiveness. And so he shushed them, and he said to the lad, "What do you want?" And the lad said, "I am here to be a knight." And Arthur said, "Only one of noble descent can be a knight." And Parsifal convinced him somehow, or maybe Guinevere whispered to Arthur something about him, gave him cachet, so to speak. But right away, Arthur says, "We don't want you to be a knight right now. You need to learn and understand." And Sir Kay unscrupulously said, "Send him out right away." He whispered in Arthur's ear. And Arthur said, "No, no, no, I would not send him outside the castle gates to face Sir Ether, the Red Knight." Sir Kay said, "Why not? Sir Ether, the Red Knight, is out there. He has insulted the court. He is left in a huff. He has taken your cup. He is out there. Let the lad go and take it, and tell him if he can bring back the armor of that knight, he will be a knight himself. If he can bring back that cup, he will be the knight himself." And Arthur would not have it at first. But when the boy heard this, he begged and he pleaded. And when Sir Kay leaned over and whispered, "It'll be fine. Sir Ether will just knock him around. He represents no threat. No actual threat. He's not going to be hurt because he's not a threat. And he'll just get beat up." That's what Sir Kay said. Not that he cared, but more like he wanted this kid out, you know. And so Arthur allowed him to go out. And just before he went out, a woman of the court laughed. Yeah. I think she laughed actually perhaps when she first saw him. At some point of this encounter in King Arthur's court, a woman of the court laughed. And people just turned and looked at her because, you see, and I don't know how many people knew this, but she had taken a vow not to laugh unless she saw the noblest knight that would ever be, the knight that would behold the Grail. And she had just laughed. And so, you know, this tells you something right away, as this young fool goes out to challenge a seasoned knight for dubious reasons. But what is worse, Sir Kay, the churlish courtier, berated her most severely for having broken the court's decorum by laughing. And it was really bad, a bad breach, you know, of just consideration and moral ethics for him to use such a pretext to persecute her. But this is what he did. It was possible for him to do this. But again, the lad was kind of like heedless of that because he probably couldn't understand the way these things kind of just suddenly flared up. Is this another indication that the primordial feelings are still there? You know, the aristocratic decorum is evolved out of savage emotions. You know, this is part of the tension that gives it its dramatic import. This is why so many of our aesthetic conceptions, you know, have kind of their propulsive root from those times. And anyway, out rides Parsifal. No, yeah, he's riding on his swayback nag. He got it back from the page. And there is Ether, and Ether just sees this, you know, impudent, strange person in sackcloth and galoshes coming up to him on a strange, beat-up old horse. And he's barely a teenager. And so Ether says, what are you doing here? Why are you here?" "I've come for your armor." And knights, when they hear challenges like this, then for them it's perfectly within their courtly prerogative, you know, to say, "Okay, then come and take it." And things get really intense from there. They can. And they did in this case. So young Parsifal on a swayback nag just comes at him. And with hardly any motion at all, he's an experienced warrior. Sir Ether just knocks him off of his horse with a bump of his shield. And Arthur lands on the ground, and actually Sir Ether, he climbed off of his horse and he began to beat the lad. And when he had beaten the lad senseless, or so he thought, he climbed back on his horse. And that's when Parsifal threw his javelin. He threw his javelin, and it struck Sir Ether right in the place where his visor had a gap. And Sir Ether fell to the ground dead. slain by a javelin, which is a peasant's weapon. And then Parsifal says, okay, now his armor is mine. I have killed him. I have defeated him. And he goes to pull off the armor. This is hard to do. Helmets themselves, so I'm told, weigh like 100 pounds or can. He's trying to pry off and unfasten the armor without damaging it off of a dead body. And by now, the young page who had taken an interest in him came out to see what was going on. And when he saw him do this, he tried to stop it. He said, no, this is a breach of decorum for you to do this, first of all. And what's this javelin doing here? Don't you realize you do not slay knights with a javelin? And Parsifal just said, help me get this armor. I am to wear his armor. And the page actually helped him. They took the armor off of that corpse. And Parsifal climbed on the red sorrel horse of the Red Knight, Sir Ether, wearing the Red Knight's armor. And that is how he rode back to Camelot. And that is how he found out that Cunuaire, this was the woman's name in the court, was being unfairly persecuted by Sir Kay, perhaps on his account. And other things began to dawn on him of perhaps this knightly business. So much has happened already, but it seems there are things that are also happening that seem unjust. And as a knight, I have to write that, but I seem to be causing it instead. But the story doesn't take us into his mind right away in that way. Not in that way. It just tells us what happened. And then what happened from there. Well, he had a lot of adventures from there. I just want to relate the basic images, actually, in some of the story to give us an idea of the way that the story works. Because the way it works now is the way it has always worked. It's that kind of a story, like it's a spiritual narrative. And perhaps, in the narrative itself, in the course of it, we will find the actual vibe of what I might mean by that when I say that. Well, I don't know. We'll just have to find out now. Which is what he did. He crossed another stream, another river at the shallowest place. He came to a house. He knocked upon the door. And a gray-haired man answered it. And he was a knight. It was Gurnemanz. And when he saw Parsifal, he was reminded of one of his slain sons. And he welcomed then the lad in and gave him a place to stay for a while, and actually taught him a little bit about what it meant to be a knight, because he was himself, though old, was a knight. And of course, Parsifal, first thing he says was, I will learn from you, because my mother said to learn from someone, an old one who has gray hair, and you are that, so I will learn from you. And Gurnemanz listened to him, and he was sometimes put off by some of his seemingly willful innocence, though it was really true innocence, and at the same time perplexed by the canniness and the shrewdness and just the basic bearing and the mysteriousness of it all. He just seemed like whatever you said to him was going to come true in this unpredictably peculiar way. And so he had some advice for him based on that. Gurnemanz did. He said, well, first of all, a knight listens to the vulnerable and the meek and helps them and defends them if he can. A knight is also holds his own counsel among the kings and the queens and the courtiers, actually. And also, a knight does not dress like that in buskins and sackcloth. But Parsifal said, but these are what my mother gave me, and I wear the armor over them anyway. No, a knight must be a knight all the way from the skin out. You must wear garments of silk and wool and not sackcloth and buskins. But my mother gave them to me. There's another thing I want to tell you, young man. Do not speak of your mother so much. It is unseemly. Also, I want to remind you of this. Don't ask too many questions, said Gurnemanz to Parsifal. And Parsifal takes these things to heart, You don't know what's going to happen from there, but he does. And so eventually he leaves behind his sackcloth and he leaves behind his buskins. And he assumes the garments of silk and wool and wearing the armor of the Red Knight, learning that he slew him unjustly also with the javelin and under the circumstances. Gurnemanz also told him, yes, defeat people And but do not kill needlessly. If an opponent is defeated and asks for mercy, do not kill him. There's a lot of good things you can do. You can send them out to right some wrong, because if you let them live, they are beholden to you. It's part of the knightly code. And so Parsifal took that well to heart. And so there were times when he defeated knights in various forms of jousting and combat, and he would send them one after the other back to Camelot to serve the women that he felt that he had wronged, even without intention, from whom he took the brooch, the one whom laughed. The one with the corpse of the knight who told him his name, that was his cousin Sigun. And she had a different place in Parsival's destiny and in his consciousness, as you will find out. Parsival eventually, don't want to go into it too much because I've got to pay attention to the time, of course. Parsival eventually found himself inside of a castle besieged. And they were without food because they had been besieged for a long time by an army led by two knights, or a particular knight and his major domo. And they, even though the castle was surrounded by a wide and raging deep canyon, gorge, and river, it could be approached from the west, and siege was laid to it, all because Clymede, the one king, wanted to marry the queen inside. She had now become queen when her father died, and he wanted her hand in marriage. Her name was Condwiramers, and she lived in this castle, and now she was the mistress of this castle, commanding these armies defending against this siege. And they were holding their own. They would not be able to enter, but they were starving from the inside. So that when a red knight came riding up on a red sorrel horse and saw the river and looked up and down the river, this is Parsival, by the way, but now he's been through some things, he's learned some things, and now looking at the river, he sees no shallow place to cross. Instead, he sees a bridge. It's a rickety rope, narrow bridge across the canyon. So with his mighty war horse, he begins to ride across the bridge toward this castle, which seems to be so distressed. I don't think he sees the armies on the other side besieging it. He knows there's trouble there and he wants to help. He's crossing this narrow bridge, but it's impossible and dangerous. The horse is too heavy. The bridge rocks too much. It's over this raging river gorge. So Parsival steps down, and step by step, he guides himself and his horse across the bridge in slow and measured steps, in keeping with the way that a rope bridge, can hold its own and not move too much, carrying such a load of two moving figures, one of them very, very heavy and with a great many legs. But he's able to finally get into the way of doing this. And by the time he's crossed the bridge, he knows how to cross such a bridge. But then he gets to the castle gates and he calls out, let me in. I am here to help. And a shutter opens from above, and a woman looks out and said, if you are an enemy, we have seen enough of those. We are under siege. We are starving in here. If you come as a guest, there's no food for you here. We can offer you nothing. It is best that you be on your way. And Parsival said, well, I am none of these. I am here to help. Let me in. Perhaps I can bring some kind of help. I'm a knight. And so she lets him in. She climbs down from the parapets, and she opens the great door, and he comes riding in. And he looks for the first time into the face of hunger. He sees all of these people inside the castle, and they're under great stress because they have nothing to eat, and their features are withered, and they look so desolate and sad and listless as he rides by. And take me to your king or your queen. Let me see if I can be of service here. And so they take him to Condwiramers, the queen. And she is in her court, and her two advisors actually are two hermits, or two monks. And but they're monks who live in the wilderness, so they're hermits of a kind, of a hermit order, and they are her advisors. That's a little bit different than a mercenary courtier. And but there they are, and they're in great distress. They are under siege. And Condwiramers says to him, I would offer you food, but as you can see, we have none. We are under siege. Clymede the king desires my hand in marriage, but I will not have it, so he has led his armies against me. Soon the army of his major domo, King Rum, will arrive from the west, where we have no river as a barrier. And I do not know how we can stand them against him. As you see, I have knights and soldiers, but they're near to starvation at this point. And I have nothing even to give you as a royal offering to a guest. And Parsifal, right away, these are areas of decorum that are totally new to him. But they are not, already a lot of thought, and here I want to, say this about the universal human spirit in time. Already a lot of thought has been devoted to some of these kind of notions of moral statescraft and the distribution of resources and all of these kind of things. Parsifal has only his native gift with this, and Conway she falls right into sync with him in this way. And so she says, well, okay then. Now we know what the next issue is then. The next issue is then, how will we have food for all of these people? Right away they begin to discuss the actual issues. They've set aside some of the royal niceties because they haven't the resources, to devote themselves to such things. So it's a different kind of intimacy that is established between them. And then the two monks say, actually, we have a little bit of food ourselves. We could go get some food from our garden, and we could come in and we could eat a little bit of it here. And Parsifal right away says, whatever little amount that you have, go and get it, but let us distribute it to all of the people, even though it's ever so small. And Kandwa Ramers, she liked this idea at two. And what's most interesting to me is eventually, when the food was distributed fairly and justly and seemingly spontaneously, it was like they arrived at this all at once, Parsifal, the two monks, and Kandwa Ramers. And soon, the food was out. It was just a taste, but it gave the people hope that something was coming, something. But anyway, interestingly enough, there was just a little bit of one morsel of food left over. And who ate last? Parsifal and the queen ate last, that's who. But that morsel was enough for both of them. And the way that they divvied it up was a work of art in and of itself, because it seemed like each element of each particle belonged to the appetite of the other. And so, that evening, that night, while Parsifal was asleep, Kandwa Ramers came to him. She kneeled down by his bed. Parsifal, he saw her there, and he says, that's the position that you pray in. Why are you here? What are you here for? And she said most forthrightly, I'm not here to wrestle. I'm not here for anything like that. I'm here for counsel. I am dealing with this dire situation. Oh, then come in and lay beside me, and we will put our minds together about this. And so that is what she did. And again, the ideas flowed out of that. And there was a change in their fortunes, actually, insofar as, though they were still under siege, a great ship on this river, which was actually, a traveled river, a great ship bearing a great load of food. The river was treacherous and swift in this place, and the ship foundered on the rocks. And this merchant crew with this load of food, they were going somewhere else, and they were going to, sell the food as merchants. But now they could go no further, and there was this food, and now there's all these hungry people coming down from the castle, They're outside the castle because they see the food, and they're looking with crazed eyes at these merchants, and the merchants are afraid because there's nothing that they can do about this, and these people could be dangerous, and we've got something that they want, and they seem like they'll do anything to get it, and here they come. But just then, Parsifal came up, and he said, what I bring you is, we are a castle. It's the castle of the Queen Kandwa Ramers. Jewels and gold we have aplenty, but we can't eat that. And food is what we need. So here are jewels and golds aplenty, jewels and gold aplenty to pay for what we take from your load of food. And the merchants, they were glad to have that, of course, and so they received just payment. And then because of Parsifal and Kandwa Ramers and the two monks and all the other people who understood the way that they were doing things and saw that it was a good way, a way that they could contribute to, they were able to distribute all this food fairly amongst all of them. And they realized the abundance of this food, because the way that it was distributed, everybody got what they needed, and they still had more left over for when they needed it again. And this basically lifted every threat of famine from this besieged castle. But their enemies didn't know that yet. And then eventually the armies of King Rum arrived, and Parsifal went out to meet them. Did it go like that? Yes, I think it did. Parsifal rode out to meet them, and King Rum, the major domo, perhaps he was ambitious or something, but when he saw a single knight, he said to his army, "Stay here. We'll settle it this way." Because that kind of thing was still done at that time sometimes. Rather than go to a big war, they would just put their two knights who wanted to do this, and maybe, or perhaps you might say their best knights, against each other, and whoever lost, that army went home. And so this is how it worked out, and they fought a mighty battle. But Parsifal he's born to this skill, and he's learned strangely and well. And he soon, actually both horses were worked into an exhausted lather, and so they dismounted and they went at it with swords and clubs, and they put many dents in each other's armor. But finally, Parsifal subdued him, and he stood over him, and he said, "You've aggrieved my wife, the queen, for too long now, and perhaps this could be your fate." And he got ready to deliver the coup de grace. And I say Khan Dueramers, my wife, because they'd been there for several nights. And yes, they worked together so well already. It soon became clear that it was very much part of the course of things that they become betrothed to each other. And so now they were married. And so, but King Rum said, "No, do not kill me. Do not kill me." And Parsifal, "You ask for mercy, do you? All right then, you are bound to go to Gurnemans and serve him, my mentor, my teacher." "No," said King Rum, "he will kill me right away, because one of his sons was killed at the beginning of this here siege. And he will blame me, and it'll be the end of me." "Well, I cannot send you there then." So, of course, I know who to send you to. And he sent her back. I think he sent her to Cunawara, the one who had been belabored so by Sir Kay. And so I believe by now she keeps receiving knights sent by Parsifal to serve her. And this infuriates Sir Kay, because now, he's like increasing her stature and her power and her renown, and also making it possible for these wicked knights he has defeated to redeem themselves in the service of something good. You see, this is part of what is happening already. So he sends King Rum away, and all of his armies go away. But then arrive the armies of King Clamid, and he's the one who originally wanted to marry Khan Dueramers, and his army is huge. But they meet on the field of battle, Khan Dueramers' people and the other king's people, King Clamid's soldiers, and they fight a mighty battle. And the soldiers of King Clamid believed that they were going to fight against starving people, but they find that they are not fighting against starving people, and they are being defeated. And a great number of their soldiers are taken prisoner, and they are brought back inside the gates of the castle of Khan Dueramers, and they are treated very well. They are fed food. They are fed good food, given to these people who thought that they were entering a zone of starvation. And when they saw that they had food aplenty, even to feed their prisoners generously, after Parsifal deprived them of all their weapons, he sent them back. And then they told the others, "We'll never defeat this castle, because things are not as they seem." So eventually it comes down to King Clamid and Parsifal one-on-one. Parsifal defeats him and sends him to Cunaware. And so now he's freed this castle, and so there he lives, and he's happily married, and he grows more every day, seeing all the things, administering the justice and everything. But then he decides he misses his mother, so he wants to go back and see her. Khan Dueramers, farewell for now. I must go back and see my mother. And if I meet with adventurer along the way, well, isn't that the way of a knight? And though she was sad to see him go, it was the ways of the time of these characters, and she saw him off, and away he went, looking to go back home to see his mother for a while. Strange things happened on the way there, though. And this takes us into the meat of the story, you might say. So I'll just tell you. He came to a strange place out in the wilderness, and there was a lake, a large lake, It's semi-pathless, actually. The path kind of just wound around until it disappeared. And then he found himself at the edge of a lake. But on the lake, there was a boat, kind of like almost motionless. The water almost still, very glassy. Every now and then a pulsation from an errant wind. But on the boat, there was a strange-looking man. His face was drawn and tight. And yet he was wearing a hat of peacock feathers, and peacock colors and feathers were embroidered into his clothes. And he was kind of crouching or laying. It wasn't sitting. It wasn't prone. It was kind of crumpled in the boat. And he was also, though, casting a line into the water. So was he fishing? And Parsifal said to him, "Greetings." He didn't say, "My mother told me to say that." He was past that now. "Greetings. I'm looking for a place, lodging for the night." And the fisher looked at him, and with a face drawn in anguish, he spoke slowly. The only lodging you will find is yonder castle on yonder hill." And Parsifal looked, and where he had not seen a castle before, now he saw a castle. Funny, I didn't see it before. "Thank you. Tell them when you get there. The fisher sent you." "Yes, kind sir, thank you." So when he got there, he said, "The fisher sent me." And they let him in. And they brought him to the finest chamber in the castle, the guest chamber. And servants, as was the way, universally practiced. They divested him of his armor because they were receiving a guest night. They washed him. They washed the rust from him. He'd been wearing the heavy armor so long. It was always necessary, it seems, every time he took off his armor. And the way it was with many knights, they had to wash off rust from them. They washed off the rust. And then they anointed him with ointments, spiced with aromas of far-off lands. They brought him a kind of a robe made of softest satin or wool. Perhaps it was wool lined with ermine. It was the robe, actually, of the queen. And it was brought to him, and he wore it. And he realized, oh, this is a great honor that is being bestowed upon me. I know this, though it's strange. Everyone seems so sad. And then they led him into a hall. It was a large hall. And guess what was on the other end of the hall? Against the fireplace, there was a big crackling, roaring fireplace, and there was, a high window. The casements were open, and the light was flooding in. The fire was crackling and roaring. And there was someone on a bed there, laying on furs and blankets and wrapped up and yet shivering with cold in these warm circumstances. And he recognized it. That was the fisher that I saw in the boat. And there he is, shivering in pain on a bed at the far end of the castle. And then he was led to this shivering king. This is the king of the castle, yes. And this is the fisher king. And the fisher king, in the same wounded voice, says, "Sit down. Sit down. We will eat." And then a procession entered. It was 24 maidens, dressed in the finest finery, carrying ivory frames and silver plates and goblets, silver goblets and crystal plates, and crystal lanterns burning with a colorless flame, fueled by colorless fuel, and a garnet, a large garnet carved into the shape of a table. And then the 25th one, the bearer of the Grail, she came in, and she had in her hands what Wolfram von Eschenbach tells us. she had in her hands that thing called the Grail. Grail means many things. I mean, right? It can be. It's many stories have been told about it, and it appears as many things. That thing called the Grail. Sometimes Wolfram describes it in a really vague way, or someone else in the story describes it as something like a stone. Anyway, it was brought in. They brought it all around the king, and they placed the ivory stand and the garnet table and the lanterns, and then they placed the thing called the Grail upon there. And then it was time to eat. And a plate was held, brought to the king by the servant. No, I think the king handed the plate to Parzival. I guess the guest would be served first. But Parzival didn't know what to do with the plate. So then he saw someone else. Perhaps it was the servant of the king, or perhaps the king was strong enough to lift it himself. I like to think that the king lifted the plate himself to the Grail. And it became filled with food, the finest food of all kinds, meats and fruits and delicious things. A goblet was handed. The goblet became filled with wine when it was placed close to the Grail. So Parzival did the same. And then in procession, all the other guests in the hall, they came, and they too were fed invisibly. Food appeared when it was placed near the Grail. And then they ate. And then the king gestured, and a servant brought him a beautiful sword with a ruby in the hilt. And the Fisher King said, "Here, I present you with this sword. I fought many battles with it until I was wounded. Take this sword." And then he looked at him. And all the people, with their sad, expectant eyes, they looked at Parzival. And Parzival felt them all looking at him. And he wondered why. But then the words of Gurnemanz, his mentor, his teacher up to then, advised him, don't ask too many questions. And he thought it best to restrain himself in this strange court. So he merely nodded his head. And then, like that, the feast was over. Everything was taken away. They led Parzival to his bed. They laid him down. They brought him some mulled wine or something, a customary aperitif, I guess, or nightcap. And then the servants all left. And then Parzival tossed and turned in the bed that night. It was hard to sleep because his mind was tormented by visions of piercings and cuttings and battle and pain. And when he woke up in the morning, no one was there. The castle was there. The rooms were there. He rushed out into the hall. The hall was empty. He thought something had happened, but he didn't know what. He might have been a little offended, too, that no one was there to help him put on his armor. But he got himself together. He put on his armor. He went out, and there was his horse. There was his horse at the gate with the lance, his lance, and everything there. And the sword given to him by the Fisher King was there too, and his own sword, but there was no one else around. The lance was kind of leaning against the horse, and the horse was merely waiting. And so he climbed on the horse, and he was actually, at that point, he was rather angry. Why haven't they seen me off? But then he thought, oh, perhaps they're in battle somewhere. Perhaps they think I'm a coward, and they've gone off to battle without me. I must go and help them and prove my worth to them, so that they will not have made it seem as if I was deserted here. And so he went to the drawbridge. He was crossing the drawbridge, and he had barely crossed the drawbridge, just in time, actually. It was a little bit too soon when the portcullis, if that's what it's called, was abruptly jerked, almost so that his horse stumbled a little bit. And Parzival turned around, and there was a servant of the castle turning the crank and lifting up the castle, the moat, the door over the moat, and called out to him, "Goose, why did not you ask the question? I want nothing more to do with thee." And then he actually said, "May God damn the light that falls upon your path." A harsh curse. And then the door was shut. And Parzival, well, he did not know what to do until he saw the tracks on the ground. And he thought, I will go they have gone this way. I will go and help them on the field of battle. And then I will redeem myself for whatever, the question, he had no idea what they were talking about. And so he rode out, but he soon lost their trail. The trail became many trails. And then he was bereft. He didn't know what had really happened. He had no idea what had really happened until he came to a hut, and he called out, and he heard a woman's voice answer, so he left his weapons. And then he came to the hut to ask for succor, and there inside the hut there was a woman with an embalmed corpse. She was kneeling by him. She was wearing the garb of a peasant, and her hair had been shaved. And he came to her and said, because his heart was still moved to kindness and compassion. And he said, can I help you bury him? And she said, no, that time is not yet here. He is my husband. I've lost him most grievously. What are you doing here? Don't you know this is the wilderness? The wild mountain is nearby. It is only found by those called to it. What are you doing here? Have you been to the mountain? I have been to the mountain. Ah, tell me that you've seen the Fisher King. Tell me that you've been inside. I've been inside. I have seen it. I have seen the inside. Ah, this could only be good news, but I cannot believe you would be called there. You are Parzival. And it was only then he recognized her. You are Segun. You are my cousin. Your hair is shaved. You're in the garb of a peasant. There is your husband embalmed now. I can help you bury him. No, the only thing that would help me now is you, Parzival. Only those who are called to the Grail find the Grail. You tell me that you were there. Yes, I was there. Then did you ask the question? Tell me that you asked the question. And Parzival, he asked her if she needed any help. He asked her, Segun, how are things going? No, tell me. He wouldn't. He just instinctively didn't want to say. But finally, he said, I don't know the question. I didn't ask the question. I don't know. And then I don't need to tell you how angry she was and how severely she cursed him then, telling him he wasn't worthy of being a knight, telling him now that the pain of the Fisher King would have no end, and if he had been the one called, as was written, to come to the castle and ask the question, why did he not do it? Leave, go from my sight. She sent him away, and he went. So grievously, he still couldn't understand, but he realized that he had come very close to something that he needed to have done, but because of not knowing, because of something that he'd heard that he shouldn't have taken so literally, perhaps, a need was not met. This rankled at him. There's so much I could tell you about this now. He goes through so many adventures. He defeats so many knights. He reunites with King Arthur in the court of the Round Table. They are encamped at a distant place after having been hypnotized by 3 drops of red blood in the white snow. It was an early snow, by the way. This was autumn. It was Michaelmas, and yet the ground was froze hard, and there was snow. And he had been riding his horse solitarily, letting the horse go, looking for the castle again, finding it not. Sometimes knights would come at him and he would fight them hardly with half of a mind, because all he could think about was the Grail and how he had not asked the question. But then he was followed by a hawk as he came near to the encampment of King Arthur. King Arthur was having a festive encampment, and they were not to be jousting. He gave strict orders to his knights. We're not bringing our armor. We're not bringing our weapons. This is a festival time for Michaelmas. We are out at an encampment, and we are not to be doing warlike things. It will be for hunting and feasting and telling stories, no jousting. And yet one of the hawks, the king's hawks, had gotten loose and was now lost in the forest. And the hawk was used to being around knights. And so when the hawk perched on a tree limb and saw Parzival riding solitarily, still in the red knight's garb, whom he had unjustly slain, the hawk followed him. The hawk flew from tree branch to tree branch as Parzival blindly allowed the horse to go where it went in this pathless land. Eventually he came to a clearing in the forest where there was a flock of wild geese. The hawk, being an instinctive predator, dropped like a stone from the sky upon one of these wild geese and clutched, actually, the wild geese in at least one of his talons and almost made off with it. But the wild goose wrenched itself free and flew away, not without leaving 3 drops of blood upon the red, 3 drops of red blood upon the white snow upon the ground. Parzival stopped his horse and looked at the red blood there. And not because it looked like her in any way that you could see with your eyes. Parzival was reminded of Conduramers, his wife whom he missed so much, with these drops on the ground. And it was as if hypnotized. But he was seen by a page who told Arthur's knights, and they donned their armor thinking it was some kind of threat to King Arthur, perhaps an assassin. And they came at him 1 night, 2 nights. Arthur just felt his horse, Parzival would turn his horse when his horse shied and see some knight coming upon him, and effortlessly Parzival would knock them to the ground night after night just so he could go back and stare hypnotized at these 3 drops of red blood upon the white snow, upon the ground frozen at Michaelmas, until Sir Gawain came out. Sir Gawain was King Arthur's nephew. Sir Gawain was intelligent and noble. And Sir Gawain came out, and Sir Gawain was the first one to ask Parzival the question, what are you looking at? What hypnotizes you? And he was able to walk around the huge head of the sorrel horse, and when he saw the blood on the ground, Gawain, in his intuitive empathy, was able to realize, oh, I too was once in love, missed someone very much. And I don't know what it is about these drops upon the snowy ground, but it's in the face I see it. Are you thinking of love? Is it? I'm Gawain. You are Parzival, the one who slew the Red Knight. You are still wearing his armor. And that kind of brought Parzival out of his trance. And so Gawain was the one who brought him to Arthur's encampment, and they were glad to see him. Cunaware especially said, you have sent 3 knights to my service, and the one who originally insulted me is one of the ones you defeated in your joust when you were hypnotized over there, staring at the blood in the snow. So I'm glad to see you. Everybody was glad to see him. But Parzival couldn't tell them about the Grail castle. He knew many knights looked for the Holy Grail. He knew that. So it was impossible for him to tell them that he had actually come upon it and failed it somehow. He couldn't tell them that, He was eager to get going, but it was still a joyful reconciliation. He was a knight now, and he could see that, and even though he had slain Sir Ether unjustly and indecorously, nevertheless, this was one of the many things that he was trying to overcome, in his ascension to knighthood. But whatever satisfaction and reconciliation sense that he had felt, which would have been such a relief after so long in the wilderness that he had, was soon ended when at evening on her mule came Kundry, the sorceress, who can tell no lie. She's feared and respected. She comes and she looks at you, and you see the face of a wild boar. You see the face of a hyena. You see skin like leather. Her hands are taloned like a lion. She rides a mule. Her mouth opens, and nothing but the harsh truth comes out. No lies come out of her mouth. She's impossibly frightening, you see. And she came riding in. And she roundly cursed King Arthur for allowing a worm into the fruit. And then she came toward Parzival, and she said, you are the son of Gamurit the knight. You have a brother in the heathen lands, and his name, I will not tell you. You saw the Grail, and you did not ask the question. And she uttered it so loudly in a voice that was like shrill, screaming chains in front of everyone. It was awful and shameful, and yet he knew, of course, it was true. And you failed to ask the question. Cursed be the ground that you walk upon. Cursed be you, King Arthur, for allowing him here. And then she turned and rode away. And Parzival said, let me make amends. Let me find the castle again. And he got out of there quick. And once again, he was out on his own. And he had many adventures after that, of course. But here's where we begin to understand something. When he comes to a place, what to leave in, what to leave out, he arrives at the hut of a hermit. He has a talk with a family, 2 daughters, a husband and a wife, and they are dressed, walking barefoot on the road. And again, now it's springtime. I don't know how many years have passed. I think actually 4 years have passed. Springtime, but there's snow on the ground. And he meets this small family walking down the trail, barefoot, and he's riding on his horse in his armor. And they are dressed in simple garb, but they're on some kind of pilgrimage. And he kind of knows that. And so, I don't know what level of society they come from. I mean, I can't tell you exactly how this went through his mind, but I can tell you this was what was in his mind when they stopped, and the man called up to him and said, "What are you doing dressed in your armor? Don't you realize this is Good Friday? You need to be walking barefoot like us. You need to be honoring God." And Parsifal said, "God, the one called God. I served and found only sorrow. I do not look for a source of anything there." And the man said, "What? Are we talking about the same God? The one who was born of a virgin and took human form and died to save us? The one who created the world and the one who saved the world on this day, Good Friday? Are we talking about the same God?" And then he looked over at his daughters, and his daughters were looking up at Parsifal. And his daughter said, "Perhaps we should invite this knight for some food." They had a human feeling, And he said, "Surely, would you like to eat with us?" "No," said Parsifal, "I cannot eat with you. I do not serve the same God. I would not be worthy to be with you on this day. I must go on my own." And then the man said, "Well, perhaps you will find the hermit. He lives out here, and perhaps you will go to the hermit, and perhaps you will bring your sorrow and your anguish to the hermit, and perhaps he will help you to understand." And so that's what the old man said, and Parsifal said, he didn't answer them. And then he rode off. But now something changed, though. He began to think about the one called God. And suddenly his mother's voice came to his mind. The one called God. He remembered actually, she said he was the one who created the world and saved the world through becoming a human form. She said he's the one who put the stars in the sky. She said he's the one who puts the song in the heart of the lark. And she said he's the one who makes it impossible for her, once she realizes, not to hurt the larks, because the larks want to sing, because it is God's will. These are thoughts that filled his mind. And then Parsifal kind of just stopped, and now, we're there in his mind, and he stopped the horse, The horse was such a good horse, he could touch it with his knees, and the horse knew exactly almost what he was thinking, and the horse would stop. And Parsifal looked off into the forest, and the forest was still. Not a leaf stirred. But something stirred. But it wasn't out there. It was in Parsifal. It was hope in him. And then Parsifal, who before always would tend to let the horse take him wherever the horse wanted to go. The horse was Parsifal's greater will in this world, and it did what it did. But now Parsifal's mind, it seemed to be woken by the stirring of hope, if that's what it was, that he felt in the stillness of the forest. And then suddenly the will of his mind and the greater will of his horse suddenly participated with each other in a different way. So that when he threw the reins over the ears of the horse and he said, "Horse, take me where you want me to go," he was one with what the horse was doing, so to speak. Their wills were joined. It made it no less unknown, though, where they were going. But in this kind of the story, he goes to the source that he needs to go to. It's the hermit's hut. And the hermit takes him in. And Parsifal begins to share some of his anguish after the hermit bids him take off of his armor and helps him to wash the rust from him. I cannot offer you any food here except maybe the tips of some roots. Oh, that's fine. It is kindness that makes a feast. I have great anguish. And the hermit said, it alarms me that you do not take comfort in God. We both need the understanding that God gives us. Parsifal got up and he began to pace. Once I served the one called God, but sorrow is all that came to me. I killed a knight unjustly. I brought dishonor upon the women of the court for reasons I know not. He couldn't bring himself to talk about the Grail at all. But the hermit said, you are Parsifal. Yeah, let's get down to brass tacks here. Sit down now and understand you've got to guard against pride, child. You don't understand that, the devil rebelled against God because the devil saw the fruit and thought the fruit was there to be bitten, which is the same thing that the human saw with the human mind in relation to the fruit, not knowing that the life of the tree itself is greater than the fruit, and the fruit is only a part, and there's more to understand than the immediate bite. And you've got to guard against that yourself in your own ways. He said, I must tell you a sad story about my brother, King Anfortis. King Anfortis inherited the kingdom of the Grail. He inherited the Grail castle, but he could not carry the responsibility laid upon him to be pure in his mind. Instead, he was led astray by pride and the desire for conquest and the winning of admiration and worldly external honors that brought him into battle after battle and conquests of every kind. Even though he was called to be the king who served the Grail in the castle of the Grail, he went out to many a joust and many a battle until one day he was grievously wounded by a bamboo spear that went into his side and penetrated deeply, and festered, and there was poison in there that we knew not of. I was his brother. I was a knight. I was one of the Templar knights of the castle of the Grail. I did everything my brother did, actually. I sinned in the same ways. But we carried him back wounded to the castle, and it was the Grail that kept him alive. When the Grail was near, he would be alive. The physicians came. The physician probed into the wound and was able to extract part of the lance and part of the handle of the lance and seemingly every object that was in there, but no, there was something that remained festering, and it became painful and bad and chronic and would not go away, though it waxed and waned at certain times. Sometimes the stench of it got so bad, we would carry him down by the lake and let the wind over the lake waft away the gangrenous smell. We did that so often, people thought we were fishing or something. That's how he became known as the Fisher King, the maimed and wounded Fisher King. Said Trevisan, by the way, he said, you are Parsifal, you slayed King Ether. Your mother died after you left. It was grief for her, your mother, hers Aloyd, when you left to go to Camelot, innocent fool, to become a knight of King Arthur. She died of grief soon after. She was my sister, hers Aloyd. And Parsifal said, don't tell me that I have been the cause of 2 unjust deaths. I have to give it to you straight, young man. This is what is true. And Parsifal, he began to say more. And, the man was very factual and very clear, but, it wasn't like he was personally interested in venging on him, or anything like that. It was more like, you are here to see. This is what is to be seen, and for Parsifal, it was almost impossible for him, though he wanted to unburden himself, that he'd been to the Grail, especially when the old man began to talk about the Grail. And he went on to say, yeah, I Trevorzant, I became a hermit. I became a hermit in order to help to gather the life energies that I have and focus it in relation to the healing of my brother Anfortis, the wounded Fisher King. And it came to us actually in some ancient writing that was discovered in this world, or perhaps some other that we read, saying that one would come, who would come to the castle, and who, moved by compassion, would ask the king a question, a particular and apt question, moved by compassion, not to play a particular role of this or that thing, grandiose and heroic, but no, moved out of the immediate needs of the understanding of the wholeness of the entirety of the moral moment, would ask a question that such a one summoned, only those summoned can come. Said Trevorzant to Parsifal, and you, what is it about you anyway? I mean, yeah, you can, there's a way to be good, but there's something more that is going on with you. What is it? By the way, the horse that you came in on, that's a Grail horse. How did you come by a Grail horse? Did you slay a Grail knight? No, said Parsifal, that I have not done. I can tell you that. Sir Ether was the unjust slaying that I carry as a burden of guilt. But no, I actually, that horse, I got it in a fair fight. I jousted a knight from the Grail castle. He'd come soon upon it, actually. This is a part of the story that I can only refer to, but this is how I come by that horse. And then Trevorzant said, so what do you know about the Grail? I have seen the Grail. Trevorzant said, I told you not to be proud. Many look for the Grail, but only those called to the Grail find the Grail. It is futile to look for the Grail unless you are called to the Grail. You've seen the Grail? Did you ask the question? Are you the one? Did you ask the question? Did you see the Grail? Yes, I saw the Grail. And he said, I did not ask the question. I don't even know now. But I was there and I did not ask the question. That I want to find the castle again. And Trevorzant said to him, you didn't see with the evidence of your five senses? Trevor, no, please do not be so harsh with me. You know, I've been cursed by Kundry. I was cursed by my cousin Sugun. I can't, please don't. I mean, I know I deserve it. But Trevorzant, you know, yeah, he was personally upset. But Trevorzant said, well, this is what I mean. We are both in need of the understanding of God. And no, yes, it was written and you did not, but understand that God understands what we do not understand, and he will always believe in your ways to redeem yourself, and there will always be a way, perhaps known by him, but not by me. But I know that that is real. We both need to know that. You understand that, don't you? Trevorzant was able to kind of get that across to Parsifal, and Parsifal began to understand. And then they went out and then they fed his horse together. They could only find the bracken and the tips of the yew to feed to the horse. But Trevorzant, you know, he's a knight. He was a knight originally, and he knows all that a hermit knows, as great and mysterious as that is. But he certainly knows horses, you know, and he says, you should be fed by the Grail rather than here eating what we can offer you. You know, and Parsifal stayed with Trevorzant for about a month after that. And when he went, he was ready. He was ready to find whatever it was that it was meant for him to find, and to make whatever amends that he was able to make, and to trust in the course of his own life. So eventually, you know, I cannot tell you everything, you know, but he met Kundry again. Kundry, who can tell no lie, says to him, she kind of gives him permission. She actually escorts him. Not before he fought the battle of his life against his own half-brother, Ferafez, who came a great king himself. And they fought a great battle, the hardest battle he ever fought. And Parsifal could have given the coup de grace, not the coup de grace, but he got a blow off with his sword that would have made Firefez done for if the sword had not broken. And then Firefez is the one, with his, we're talking now about such a refined understanding of knightly manners that suddenly Firefez, he doesn't break decorum, but he says, we can stop this now, and we both have honor. You would have slain me had not your sword broken. So you do not walk away the loser. Everything has been satisfied here. And Parsifal understood, and he took off his helmet. Firefez took off his helmet, and I think it was when Firefez, I am Firefez of Anjou. Parsifal said, Anjou, how can you have that name? Those are the names of my ancestral lands. My father was Gamurit. My father was Gamurit. Brother, that's how they meet each other. There's so much, more to it there though than I can tell you. But anyway, eventually, the truth is, on her mule, veiled in a black velvet veil, with Firefez on one side and Parsifal on the other, Kundry takes them to the Grail castle. And Parsifal steps off of his horse. And no time for ceremony, he strides right in. And there is the Grail king. And it's been worse for him now, actually. So much time has passed. And this was always a time of year that was hard for him. I'm pretty sure it was Pentecost. And he actually, the Fisher King himself, the only thing that kept him alive was being close to the Grail. Sometimes he could have cycles, like when he first met Parsifal, he was out there on a boat, or if it was either that was him or some kind of projection of him or something. I mean, you can get that way with the story if you want to, but no, sometimes he could get better sometimes, but not anymore. He had to be near the Grail all the time, but he couldn't stand the pain. And he was at the point, of cursing the Grail itself. But I think it was what he said, take the Grail away. No, we cannot. Let me die. Without the Grail I will die, and then this pain will end. I will curse you if you do not do this. But they disregarded that. They kept the Grail near him because, they still had hope. And then in came Parsifal now. He strode right in. He took off his helmet. I don't think he took off his armor. He just came right to the king, who was shivering most violently. And the king looked at him. Parsifal looked at him. And Parsifal said, "What ails thee, king?" And the king said, "God be praised. You've come at last." What ails thee, king? That was the question. That was the question for Parsifal to ask. It could have been a different question for anyone else to ask, actually, because it was a question spontaneous, out of the actual course of one's life, totally uncontrived. But for Parsifal, it was, "What ails thee, O king? What ails thee, O king?" And so, it's possible to interpret that in a whole lot of ways. At this point, I just want to tell thee the tale itself, and let the tale tell us what the tale shall tell us, And though he was no longer the Fisher King, he was healed, and Parsifal became the Fisher King after that. And he reunited with Condiramers, and by now he had 2 twin sons. And Firefez married Réponse de Choix, the carrier of the Grail. But now I can tell you that's a basic sketch of the way it was, and I can tell by the time, that it is time. I've told you a little piece of it, sand grain on the shore of a vast ocean. And I thank you for your heroic listening, because it's good for all of us. I'm glad to tell this tale to you. And so long for now.